Hi guys, feel free to like and subscribe if you are enjoying this content, and if you are interested in private coaching, go to www.coachkat.org. In this video, what I'm going to talk about today is the importance of using empathy to heal from narcissistic abuse. So when you come to terms sort of with your own trauma and you do some of your own healing on your codependence and or your complex PTSD, you may be able to start tapping into your ability to empathize more with the narcissist. Think of it this way. They came from trauma, people that have highly narcissistic traits. I'm not going to say NPD because, as you know, it's like a very small percentage of the population actually has fully diagnosable NPD, but people that have highly narcissistic traits, typically it's coming from a place of trauma. And think about how the limitations of the narcissist and how that has impacted the quality of their relationships. So if you think about it in general, happiness is determined in large part by the quality of our relationships in our lives. And narcissists tend to have a very difficult time, having healthy, bonded, really good quality relationships. So they are living in general in a constant state of unresolved trauma, right? And they're not in touch typically with this truth or this reality. And they live and struggle sort of on a daily basis with these emotional demons. Part of what makes a narcissist so difficult to deal with is their lack of self-reflection, introspection, and their inability to sort of see themselves. They don't really, it's very difficult for them to perform any sort of introspection. And in order to sort of make it in the world, they tend to have to create a mask of sanity that they send to the world, right? So because to actually sort of self-reflect for them is very, very painful. So they're typically hiding behind this facade of perfection, which is, as you know, it's an image. So imagine living in that world where you cannot be your true authentic self. You feel that you have to be perfect in order to be loved. And, it's really difficult just to, sort of get about through your day because you're constantly in the state of hypervigilance, lack of trust, and sending a representative or an ambassador to the world. And imagine if you were living in a place where you feel that you have to be perfect, again, in order to be loved. You can never send your real self. You can never send your authentic self. And quite frankly, you probably aren't even in touch or don't even know what that really is. You're not in touch with your true self. And really a lot of this is because it is, it's so difficult for them to look inside because it's actually too painful. So if you can kind of look past that and realize that underneath their bad behavior, the control, the manipulation, the, sort of bluster, and all of that is this deep, deep wounding. And typically this wounding, especially if it's, sort of to the level of, sort of highly narcissistic traits, involves repeated and severe trauma from emotional and psychological abuse. And it's usually within the context of their primary attachment relationship. And this is the relationship that is supposed to be the safest. This is in the context of where they're supposed to be able to absolutely trust that person who's caring for them. And instead, they are sort of betrayed at the most base level by someone who is supposed to protect them. So this whole defense mechanism that they've developed is a defense for that trauma wound. And what happens in these relationships is there's, this very unfortunate pattern of sort of assumptions and behaviors that makes people, how they operate in the world typically makes people sort of want to reject or avoid them, right? Eventually. This may not happen at first because in the beginning they have like all this charisma and charm, but over the long haul, these people get into relationships where people, typically will end up rejecting them. And think about you if with your trauma response, if you have sort of the insecure attachment, or if you have codependence. When, I think about myself and I'm like, okay, I can relate to being triggered, because when someone's behavior triggers my fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, I get into this exaggerated response and I get taken right back to my childhood, or the little boy or girl, the little trauma baby that is being hurt. So our survival instinct kicks in, and we start, our amygdala gets hijacked, and we're no longer sort of operating from a place of like logical reasoning, right? So think of it as a narcissist is living in this state of trauma trigger all the time, and they have either none or very little awareness of it. So they don't trust anyone. They're paranoid, they're fearful, they're hypervigilant. They can't seem to form close interpersonal, authentic relationships because, again, they can't trust anyone. They have that hypervigilance. They're in this constant state of survival anxiety, and it's created initially by these emotionally detached, perfectionistic, abusive, narcissistic, or emotionally abusive caregivers, right? So imagine that, underneath this defense, or this defense system that they have, I kind of think of them as they're pretty fragile, and they have an amorphous sense of self. Their self-esteem is dependent on the feedback of others in order to survive, and that feedback could be at a societal level, because they've achieved all of this greatness in their life, or they've done all these great things. But they're looking for that constant validation. They require it, and it's because they're pretty sort of empty inside, and they don't really have a real sense of self to bring to relationships with another person. They're desperately need someone else to join them sort of in their emptiness, and they require other people as almost like their emotional punching bags, or to sort of maintain their emotional equilibrium. And of course, the ideal candidate is someone willing to be an extension of the narcissist's fragile ego. This is kind of to serve as, they need somebody who they can either look down on with either admiration and love bombing, or eventually contempt. They need somebody who's willing to kind of be in the subservient position, which of course codependents are really good at that, because codependents will let themselves be less than just in order to be loved, right? So on the outside, narcissists are appearing to be very super confident. They're always projecting this fantasy of mastery and superiority, or sort of grandiosity. And they spend their lives trying to convince the world what they themselves cannot believe. I think the key to having interactions with a narcissist is to try to have empathy for the narcissist, is to try to see this really traumatized child inside of them. If you can see that is really the place that they're coming from, even if they're not aware of it. And think of them as like traumatized toddlers or babies, and they're stuck in that state of trauma. And they were created by these, ultra perfectionistic parents who never sent the message that it was just okay to be a kid, that it was okay to be imperfect, and that they would be loved just for being. Instead, they were expected to be these perfect little robot achievers, right? Or they came from really bad trauma. So if you can try to see them as sort of like a helpless child that they once were, and put yourself in their shoes, that means to genuinely sense and sort of feel the inner world of this like wounded, terrified child. I am able to now put myself into the feeling of like, okay, what would it feel like to feel that kind of inadequacy, that shame, that loneliness, that emptiness, and this inability to form true connections and bonds with others. And in this state of like emotional emptiness, I imagine the impossible conditions that child felt that they had to meet in order to gain love, attention, or approval, right? Because again, they're with these typically, or a lot of times they have these really, really ultra perfectionistic parents, and nothing they ever do is good enough. Imagine being a little kid in that scenario. And And again, this video is not so that you will try to carry the burden of the narcissist. It is not so that you will slip on your compassion. It's not so that you will call them up and have tea with them if you've gone no contact. It's just so you can start to empathize, so you can start to maybe get to a place where you can start having some compassion in your heart. Again, you don't have to do anything with that compassion other than let it permeate your being so that you can start to heal, so you can start to give. You can start to see that actually their behaviors actually have nothing to do with you. The only thing is that you were in the line of fire because of your porous boundaries and your willingness to stay in a toxic relationship for the possibility of love and approval or financial security. So allowing yourself to stay in a position to be hurt for the possibility of love, approval, and emotional security or financial security. So that's the only thing that has to do with you, because once you start working on your codependence, once you start learning healthy boundaries, once you start setting these healthy boundaries, you're not going to actually get into like really intensely personal relationships with narcissists, because they do not like boundaries. And the more you set boundaries, the more narcissists are going to they're just not going to be wanting to deal with you. So again, it's not your job to fix or to slip on your compassion, none of that. But remember, these tools that narcissists have, this mask of perfection, the lying, the cheating, the gaslighting, the stonewalling, the manipulation, these are literally the only tools that they have in their toolbox. That's all they learn. So I think of it like we have this toolbox in life, and we put our tools in the toolbox, and as we start doing therapy, as we start working on our codependence, as we start learning how to set boundaries, as we get really clear on what our core values are, as we start sticking to our core values, once we start adding these tools to our toolbox, then I think the more tools we have to be able to deal with situations that are baffling to us or difficult to us. So imagine if you're a narcissist and literally the only tools you have are manipulating, cheating, lying, gaslighting, perfectionism, and being a fake person, and being this disingenuous, inauthentic person that has no integrity. Like those are your only tools. Another way to help to start to sort of get over it, forgive the narcissist, have some empathy for them is to depersonalize. Realize again that this has nothing to do with you. Although their behaviors can be horribly hurtful, it's actually not personal. They're just doing this. That's just what they do. I did a silly video once about there's pigeons. They're sitting in a tree. They sit when they sit in the tree, they poop. You are sitting underneath the tree and the pigeon is pooping on you, and you're yelling at them, shaking your fist, going, "Stop pooping on me!" And like, the pigeon is just doing what it does. When it sits in the tree, it poops. And your choice is to sit under that tree and yell at the pigeon and tell it to stop pooping, but it's just doing what it does. So your choice is you can get up, you can stand up, put your shoulders back, walk forward, and move out from under the tree. You chose to sit under the tree. So again, I mean, if you can help to depersonalize it and realize this is how they operate in the world, it's actually not personal. You just, because of your porous boundaries, because of your codependence, you just chose to stay in relationship with them because you were willing to sacrifice anything for quote unquote love, right? So, again, narcissists, they want to fuse with others who are successful or who have perceived qualities that will help to stroke the narcissist's ego. Could be that you're very successful. It could be that you're very good looking. It could be that you're very kind. It could be that lots of people like you. It could be a million reasons, but whatever the reason, they're not with you for your individuation. They're not with you because of who you are as a human being. They're with you for how you make them look. So when the object, which is how narcissists look at other people, or it's really a human, but when they fall short, which is inevitable because all humans are imperfect beings, a narcissist is going to become contemptuous, and they're going to try to get rid of those bad feelings that they have that have been aroused by projecting them onto others, because again, they cannot handle their own feelings, right? So they're always projecting and deflecting onto others. And when that happens, what can be really bad for the recipient is because the narcissist, by that point, when they see that you're less than perfect, which is inevitable, because remember, their relationships are idealization, devaluation, and discard, they may become enraged when the pipeline for their ego inflation is ruptured, right? Sandy Hotchkins, in her book, Why Is It Always About You, mentioned that it's just really important to be self-aware enough to remove your emotional needs and responses from your interactions with the narcissist. As challenging as this may be, I'm just reading from her. When you are triggered by a narcissist, try to process the emotions in a way where you are not at their mercy or depending on them to empathize or help you manage your feelings in any way. So just think of it this way, like your job is to learn how to process and deal with your emotions completely independent of any sort of cluster B that you may be interacting with. Like your job is to set boundaries and do your own work with your therapist, with your coach, with the books you've been reading, with your journaling, where you can help to manage your own feelings, to regulate your feelings and to be well. And again, you're going to need to be very clear and firm with your boundaries. And but you can also do this while you're validating your own emotions and actually theirs. Remember, they are particularly vulnerable to shame, and they may become easily enraged, especially in public. If there's any intimation of public shaming, they absolutely freak out, right? So it's better not to, sort of trigger a narcissist shame response. But it's not easy because they have this hair trigger, right? So you never know what's going to quite trigger them, and they're very overly sensitive to criticism. So they will react the worst to shame responses if you're poking a hole into their grandiosity. If you're suggesting that they maybe don't know everything, if you're suggesting that they are less than perfect. But if you can keep seeing them through this as the vulnerable, neglected child underneath all of that sort of bluster, underneath all of that sort of mask and that grandiosity, if you can just keep seeing that really ultimately these people are vulnerable, neglected children that are in a constant state of trauma. If you think as a codependent you struggle, I really think, cluster Bs or people that have these highly narcissistic traits, they struggle a lot more because they have the inability to form intimate, closely connected relationships with other human beings. And that is a very, very lonely place to be. And that's why it's super important to be really clear on your own strengths and weaknesses, as well as those of the narcissist, so you can best handle and manage the unhealthy narcissism. So being able to see the good and bad qualities of ourselves and others in a realistic light, so that if they're projecting their stuff onto you, if you already know what your true qualities are, what your shortcomings are, what your failings are, but also what you're particularly good at, if you're able to fully and clearly recognize with humility like your strengths and weaknesses, then when they try to sort of insult you in some way or demean you in some way, if you're really clear on what you really are, what the truth is for you, then you're not going to take it so personally, because they're just not going to have that kind of power over you, because you'll be like, yeah, I know who I am. I know what my strengths and weaknesses are, and you don't get to decide for me how I'm going to feel about myself, right? So that's why it's really important to be able to be real clear on that, be able to see, the good and bad qualities of ourselves and others, and to view relationships and people as complex, imperfect, and whole without rage and shame is a huge sign of emotional maturity. So if you are able to, sort of look at relationships and people as these very complicated, very complex beings, but I don't need to have rage and shame if they're different than me, if they don't agree with me, if their weaknesses and strengths are different than mine. I can just see that we're all like really, complicated, complex, whole, and different people, then I don't get upset if people don't agree with me, or if they're not exactly on the same page, because I recognize that we all have these vastly different emotional landscapes internally, as well as minds, right? So this is going to help you from getting caught up into the narcissist delusion, right? And of their perfectionism and their contempt, right? So you don't need to get sucked into their delusional thinking. You don't need to get sucked into their projections and deflections, or where they try to put all their bad feelings onto you. If you're clear on who you are, what your strengths and weaknesses are, what their strengths and weaknesses are, then you're not going to give into that delusion of their crazy making sort of, I think of it as like narc land. Like, you're not going to go into the crazy narc land. It's that's why it's also very, very important to have very strong, healthy boundaries. To be able to understand, regulate, and process your own emotions, right? So you can safely and productively experience some empathy for them. Because if you're able to self-regulate, process your own emotions, not take things personally, not accept their projections or deflections, because you're really clear on who you are. If you're able to do that, then and see them as a small, wounded, vulnerable child. They are like toddlers, and they're really desperately in need of affirmation and love, like all humans, right? That doesn't mean, again, that you need to slip on your compassion or break no contact or go back to them, or that you can fix it. It does mean that you should have a healthy detachment coupled with some empathy in your heart, right? And this will help you to better understand and forgive. Now, again, I'm not suggesting, especially if you're codependent, that you need to run and go try to fix a narcissist or love them back to whatever, or even have contact with them or have tea with them or any of that. No, I'm not suggesting that, but I'm just suggesting like a healthy detachment coupled with some empathy, being able to empathize that this is a trauma baby. Like, they're traumatized, and their behaviors are awful, and how they treat other people is awful, and their inability to bond is awful, and their lying and gaslighting and all of the stuff they do is not fun, right? It's not fun at all. But again, if you were in the relationship with them, in a very close and a personal relationship with them, it is probably because you have very porous boundaries. So your part is, learn how to set healthy boundaries, get really clear on your strengths and weaknesses, build your self-esteem, because the key, I believe, one key to having very good self-esteem is to set and maintain and hold and respect your own boundaries, and have some internal boundaries. In order to do that, it's important that you get really clear on what your core values are. Know what they are. Know what you will and will not tolerate in relationships, and what your values are, what your ideals are, what you want to live up to, who you want to be. And so I'm not suggesting that you slip on your compassion if you're codependent. I really need for you to hear that. But what is important is if you can actually develop some empathy in your heart without having to do anything about it. You don't need to fix anything. You don't need to do anything, but develop some empathy by seeing that this person is deeply wounded, and that wound came from a primary caregiver who did not do right by them, right? Similar to whatever your wound is. If you're on here, you're codependent, or if you have insecure attachment, or if you have ambivalent attachment, then you also have a wound. You have some trauma, right? So yes, yours manifests differently. It doesn't manifest in quite the same ways, and in some ways it's far less destructive in relationships, but it still has its own toxicity. So I don't know if this is helpful for you, but this is just my suggestion, is to really tap into your empathy and into understanding that narcissists, people that have highly narcissistic traits, are trauma victims. So go ahead and go to www.coachkat.org, and I hope this is helpful for you. If you're interested in private coaching, contact me. The best way is via email, and then we can communicate, and I would love to help you on your journey of overcoming codependence and your trauma. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.